So Lin-Manuel, let's begin at the very end. You have Eliza's monologue where she really frames herself as kind of how Alexander Hamilton's story kind of came to be eventually. Why did you end that way?
A couple of reasons. I remember being knocked flat by the final chapter of Ron's book, where you see that Eliza lives twice as long as Hamilton was alive, and really dedicates herself to his story being told, but then also goes on to have just this extraordinary life of her own. And one of the details that was too on the nose to even put in the final song, she opened a school in Washington Heights, which was what my first musical was about. And I even wrote a lyric about that, and I was like, I can't go there. It feels self-referential, and we just want to be swept up in the tears and the orphanage. But, I think one of the major themes of the show is who tells your story determines how your story gets told. And so the fact that Eliza lives for so long, almost up to the Civil War. I mean, she meets Lincoln as a senator, is extraordinary, and sort of tells us everything we need to know.
Women are very consistently written out of the narrative or just left out altogether. And you really could have done, a show called Hamilton about Hamilton and none of the women who are in his sphere, but they actually have a very big role, big central role. Why was that?
Well, you have to understand, I'm a product of the school play. I didn't fall in love with musicals by seeing a lot of musicals. I was like most people, you can afford maybe a special occasion birthday musical once every few years. You can afford to go to Broadway. And so I really fell in love with musicals by doing the school musical. And that, girls try out more than guys. I remember directing in high school and being like, it's so unfair that there's so many male parts when women are the ones who run the show here and are the reason this theater exists. And so, I think I think of In the Heights as like the ideal school musical, just lots of great parts for women. And so even when I was writing Hamilton, I just enjoy writing those parts, and they're complex and interesting parts of history. And I really tried to lean into the fact that we have these incredible, intelligent, complex women at a time when they're not given full agency. So they determine history in the ways they can. It's why I conveniently forgot the Schuyler sisters' many brothers. They have brothers in real life, but I wasn't interested in the brothers. I was interested in these sisters and how they navigate the world.
At one point, of course, in the rap, right, we hear a sister talking about her role in society, both wildly wealthy, but also kind of stuck, right, determined by who she marries and who she associates with. And again, you don't get a lot of that insight into what's happening in women's lives, I think, as we explore somebody else's life altogether.
Yeah, and I think that one that was interesting to write about. Two, I think it's interesting to note that I almost didn't know if Angelica was going to be in the show, because I've said this a million times. I will say it a million times more. You could write 5 to 10 musicals about Hamilton, never touching the same reference points, and still have full set. It's 3 lifetimes worth of a life in one life. And one of the things that was a big determining factor in whether I pursued storylines or not was how much of Hamilton's life do they thread through? Hamilton had close friends at the end of his life, one of whom delivered his eulogy, who is not in the show, because we meet him too late, and it's too late. We're moving too fast at that point. But including Angelica allowed us to tell a kind of story that isn't in the conventional, and this is his wife and this is their life together, but she occupies a far more interesting place. She was a contemporary. She corresponded with Thomas Jefferson. She corresponded with all this. She was known as this very witty, worldly person. And so the natural question is, well, isn't she the more natural romantic match for Hamilton and as an intellectual match for Hamilton? And so writing about all that was just really interesting. And then once we wrote the suite of Helpless and Satisfied, we said, we can't wait this long to meet these women. And so Schuyler Sisters came next, actually, because we wanted to meet them before Hamilton met them. Because we fell in love with I fell in love with the characters as I was writing them, and I wanted as much of them as possible.
Do you fall in love with the characters some more than others? I mean, is there a Schuyler sister that you'd say you love the most? And does that person get the bigger role, or do you love someone who has fewer words? How does it work?
Yeah, well, I think what you have to do as a writer is find your way into every character. You know, these are all really flawed people, and these are all my versions of these people. And so what you latch on to, or what I find I latch on to, is I find my way into each character. You know, I think finding with Angelica, who is someone who is near Hamilton, Alexander and Eliza's orbit their whole life, and may have had an emotional affair with Alexander, and but really doted on this family in addition to her own. That was an interesting thing to write about, and there's such a great tradition of unrequited love songs in musicals. I think of On My Own from Les Miserables, which is sort of the gold standard. And so I was like, how can I out on my own? You know, so there's challenges as a songwriter and as a dramatist. But you know, the fun is in getting to play all of them. I loved being Angelica while I was writing Satisfied. I loved being Eliza while I was writing That Would Be Enough. I remember, I think if there's any song that's kind of a love letter to my own spouse, it's That Would Be Enough. And, you know, there's no historical reference point for that song. There's no moment where Eliza sat Alexander down and said, I love you and come home and spend more time with us. That was a song I felt like I needed to write, and Eliza needed to sing. So there's you know, you find your way in through research and empathy, and then if you're lucky, they start talking back to you and telling you what they need to say. And that was certainly the case with That Would Be Enough, and several other moments with these ladies.
Let's talk about the Peggy character. For the longest time, my children would run around when they were referring to a sibling who was a fifth wheel. It was like, and Peggy. It's like the worst thing you could possibly be in my family was the and Peggy, who was getting dragged along because someone was forcing you. You have Jasmine playing both roles when you opened. Well, why have one actor portraying two roles?
It was sort of a dramaturgical solution to the biopic problem. How do you make, first of all, listen, how many people can you name in your young life that were so formative that you never see again? Or people that you've met recently that have changed your life that there was no clue they were coming when you were a teenager or a young adult. So that's just an issue with life. So how do you, if you're going to dramatize a life, how do you keep it compelling without just an enormous cast of characters? And so one of the things we hit upon early was, if we double cast characters that are central to Hamilton's young life and then use those same actors to portray, you know, when David shows up and he goes, I'm Thomas Jefferson now, you're like, yeah, because we've fallen in love with David in the first act. And now he's dressed like Prince meets Andre 3000 and he says he's Thomas Jefferson. And so instantly we have a connection that we might not have had with a new actor coming out of nowhere. And so then once we made that decision, we began to try to thematically tie them. Not that their purposes are similar in Hamilton's life, but that there's a resonance. So Lafayette, who is the Frenchman in his life, you know, turns into the Francophile, who is fighting to, you know, work with the French Revolution and actually was friends with Lafayette in France. You know, Mulligan and Madison are studying contrasts. We have Mulligan as this bombastic, Buster Rhymesian guy, and then James Madison, who was famously very sickly, couldn't have looked less like Oak. He was maybe cleared 5 feet, and so again, it's also gives the actor more to do because it's like this study in contrasts. And with Peggy and Mariah, you know, the goal was sort of these. It's these women who loved Alexander in very different ways. There's correspondence between Peggy Schuyler and Alexander in their young life, where she actually really he became a confidant to her. He was sort of like the cool older brother-in-law. And there's some very sweet correspondence there. And then there's Mariah Reynolds, who really doesn't get to tell her own story, either in history or in our show. I mean, it's a very Hamilton, Alexander-centric view of what went down. You know, Catherine Ryan did a brilliant stand-up routine lampooning that, about like, this is a kid, she's stuck in it, like, this is horrible. And that's all true, you know, but we're hearing Hamilton's perspective because that's the perspective that survives. So that's sort of the thinking behind the double casting.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that sort of everybody reads into the characters and what they see the way they want to see it, right? I think Mariah, who I've been calling Maria forever, I'll still tell everybody it's Mariah, really, I think a lot of people glommed onto that as sort of an example of Me Too, right? And now I think Black Lives Matter. I can't think of our founding fathers without thinking of most of them as being Black. I know that's not accurate, but I can't help myself. And so I wonder if it's encouraging, exciting, or just strange to have people kind of foist onto your product, your creation, kind of the element that they want to take out of it. Well, this is really a story about this. It's actually a story about this.
But that's always been the case with Hamilton. And that's what's so interesting about it. When you start talking about the founding of our country and the inherent contradictions and flaws of it that have been there since someone wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. We fell short of it the moment the ink dried. You know, that's all true. You are dealing with people's emotions about their own country, and that's as loaded as it gets. And so, yes, it's been interesting, but it's also, in a weird way, it's also what the show's about. The show is because one of the things I realized, I was not the show itself.
It's pretty remarkable to me that I think many of us went through school thinking that the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And it's not until you get a lot older that there's sort of a little asterisk.
Yeah, little asterisks. Oh, wait, not you women.
No, not everybody who did mention that. And I remember learning that and just having it be so eye-opening and really having it underscore just how frequently these stories are left out of history. I mean, they're just not in the storytelling at all.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite shows is Drunk History on Comedy Central, which is such a silly premise. You get the narrator, I've been on it, you get the narrator drunk and they tell a story, but one of the things they've subversively done is tell a lot of stories that are not in our history books, in a humorous way, but in an accurate way. And I think that that's also what this moment seems to be about when we're debating statues, when we're debating the founding. We need so many reminders because of how much our history textbooks left out that the oppression, the right to vote, these are recent things for some people. You know, history is, you know, history isn't dead. It's not even past. You know, we're living with the legacies of these things, and it just wasn't that long ago.
And yet we argue
that long ago.
Right? Today, we, as you say, you know, people fell short of their goals and ideals the minute they were signing their names to the document. Yeah. And yet, to this moment, we are still fighting about that. I mean, it seems almost offensive for some people, this idea that somehow history or our founding fathers got some of this stuff wrong or contradicted themselves or were hypocritical as they said one thing and lived another life. Would you have wanted to, if someone said, listen, Hamilton can be 70 hours long, do whatever you want, here's all the money to produce it, what would you have added to that? Because I feel like there's so much of just that we live in today where people don't want to confront the stuff that was bad.
Yeah.
Like every founding father had to be the greatest, most wonderful, lovely person ever, when even they in their own writings admitted their flaws.
Yeah, and that's certainly not the premise of our show. I don't believe we celebrate them. I believe we try to get as much of their flaws and humanity into as 2.5 hours of a musical and still let you out before
If I
Les
give you
Mis
10
lets out
hours,
next
12
door.
hours, 50 hours,
Yeah.
would you
But
have?
you know, I one of the things I made available on the Hamilton mixtape was I did write a third cabinet battle, debate about slavery. The only time slavery came to the floor, it was by a delegation of Quakers led by Benjamin Franklin. And I made it a closed door debate between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison. And Hamilton, and it was very cathartic to write. It was cathartic to write Hamilton calling George Washington out on his owning hundreds of people. At the same time, none of them did enough. So, can we afford 4 minutes where, everyone gets to rage and the audience feels great because we're finally saying the thing, but they didn't do anything. None of them kicked the ball down the field, and so it just it didn't fit in our 2.5 hour show. But I think if there's a 4 hour, 5 hour show, I think that's an excellent debate to be had, because the struggle always with telling a story set against this brutal practice is, they're all complicit. When you buy a ticket and walk in the door, and that's why it's the third line of our show. They're all complicit in this system. This was going on while this story is being told, and so how do you? And at the same time, it would take a civil war to finally begin to uh, undo it. And so, does it make sense to spend 5 minutes on something none of them did enough about? That was my struggle as a dramatist. And so I wrote it and I made it available so you could see it and hear it, but it didn't make the final show.
You say history's not past, and it's so interesting because I wonder, as we create history now, I feel like so many other voices have just taken the opportunity to plant a stake in the ground and say, no, 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 this is the story of Native American people, or Native
Yeah,
American women, or women
absolutely.
who are missing, or women who are sexually assaulted, or people of color, or people who are fighting for the people who are unjustly incarcerated. And it feels like now there's more opportunities because people don't want history to kind of steamroll them, and a narrative comes out the other end and they're not even mentioned in it. When you look forward 100 years, how will people think about the history of women the next 100 years after this first 100 years since the 19th Amendment?
Oh, I mean, it is. There are way more qualified people to discuss this than me, but this is. We've come so far, and we still have so much farther to go. When I think of, particularly in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is led by Black women, and so many women at the forefront of the change we're seeing in the streets and in the protests, and it's been really extraordinary. And also, the record-setting number of female elected officials in the last midterms in 2018. The And yet, um, don't go to a comment section of like a female elected official. I mean, the harassment, it's still so gross, and it's still so um, offensive to some people. I mean, it's really it's one of the reasons I try to stay off the internet as much as possible. It's just like the disparity is so uh, crazy. But I think it's an extraordinary time, and that thing what you mentioned about um, being part of the narrative. I think that's what everyone's asking for, and that's what's so exciting about this moment, is that we're seeing the narrative being shaped, and that makes for, just in my corner of the world of theater and movies and storytelling, like, that just means we get richer stories. It means we don't get the same stories over and over again. We're getting richer stories and new stories. So it's exciting in my field to have more voices in the room.
In so many ways, as much as it's history, I feel like we're also on this cycle of repeating, right, back over and over and over again. I never thought we'd be continuing to debate women's rights or civil rights, or the Voting Rights Act would be something that people would have to fight for again.
Right.
It just seems kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that happens at the end of Hamilton is the pendulum swings back, right? It goes from Hamilton in power to Jefferson in power. He's outlived by his enemies, and I definitely feel like the past 3 years have been a pendulum swing back moment. The Voting Right Act of 1965 was so important. We've just lost one of our greats, John Lewis, and who's a giant, a moral giant in our country. And yeah, and we're having to fight some of the same fights again, but hopefully I'm hopeful that that comes with additional gains on top of re-legislating that fight. It has to.
Lin-Manuel, nice to chat with you.
Likewise.
And now